The first thing to remember is Prime Minister Abe has invested more in the relationship with Donald Trump than any other world leader. 6 meetings so far, and not a lot to show for it so far. He's been left on the sidelines on the North Korea issue, where there have been 6-party talks right now. It looks like bilateral talks, and then we'll come back to trade. But the tariffs were a bit of a humiliation to him in that they didn't exempt Japan. But we'll come back to that. On the issue of Korea, what they're worried about is that the U.S. would be willing to negotiate the intercontinental ballistic missiles that can reach the U.S., but would leave untouched the short-range missiles that the Japanese worry the most about. So what Abe really wants to hear from President Trump is that in these bilateral talks, they will also represent the Japanese interests, which is what we didn't hear from new Secretary of State Mike Pompeo in his confirmation hearings.
Gillian, there is also a summit within the next 2 weeks, I believe, between the North and South Korean leaders. I can imagine that that is causing some agita for Mr. Abe, in part because of reports this morning that those two leaders might negotiate a formal end to the state of war that's existed between those two countries for 60+ years.
Well, absolutely. As Fred just said, this is a real slap in the face for the Japanese, because the Japanese feel that they have lived with the North Korean threat in a very real way for a long time. I used to live in Japan myself for many years, and there was a constant sense of readiness and fear about what North Korea might do in terms of missiles. And Japanese friends of mine have been receiving advice from the local government officials in recent months to prepare into bunkers and things like that in case the North Koreans try and actually hit them. So they feel they've been on the front line, and to be ignored right now or cut out of the discussion is very humiliating. The other issue is that there's very, very strong popular sentiment inside Japan that the Japanese must demand more information, if not the return of the Japanese citizens that the North Koreans abducted. And once again, that issue looks as if it's being swept to the sidelines. That makes the Japanese pretty unhappy. And the key thing to realize is that Abe is actually losing popularity inside Japan at the moment very fast. His approval
he's
rating is only 30%.
A lot of issues in Japan, Gillian. What about progress on trade, Gillian, and this whole issue with the TPP? He went along and created this relationship with all of the other countries besides the United States. Now there's talk about whether or not the U.S. will get back in or out. At minimum, an exemption when it comes to the steel tariffs would be a big win for him.
Well, Japan was pulled into the TPP under President Obama, and Abe spent a lot of his political capital selling it to the public. So to have the US pull out has been, again, another big slap in the face. I think what both sides want to play for right now is time above all else. There's cosmetic things they can do. I mean, essentially, the Americans, President Trump, want to seem as if he's trying to cut what is a big trade deficit with Japan. The Japanese want to make sure that they get some progress on the steel tariffs. They're not that important economically, but symbolically, it's been very, very painful to see them excluded from the exclusions that the Americans extended to others. But there are also things the Japanese can do, like granting American firms a bit more market access. So there is some scope for negotiation, but I think both sides want to play for time.
Fred, what does Abe need to walk away with? Does he need to walk away with some sort of exemption on the 232 steel and aluminum tariffs, or what?
So I've talked to Japanese officials about that. Obviously, they'd like to have a signal that the exemption would be okay. These tariffs were on national security grounds, so your ally is Japan. Why do you need them in place? On the issue of TPP, it was really Abe who pushed to have this negotiated among the 11. He had a bit of a green light from President Trump to go ahead after the U.S. pulled out. But I don't think President Trump, in fact, I know President Trump was surprised that he brought it together that quickly. Abe, as I understand, is coming to Mar-a-Lago with a framework of how the U.S. could come back in. There are 20 areas of this negotiation that have been suspended, all of which were demands on the U.S. side. So the Japanese could make it easy for the U.S. to get back in, but you have 11 countries that are going to ratify this, and they're not going to want to renegotiate the whole thing. There's a chance for side letters on certain things. But watch particularly news on farmers. It's the farmers that are really putting the pressure on President Trump right now.
Hey there, thanks. Thanks for checking out CNBC on YouTube. Be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on all of the day's biggest stories. You can also click on any of the videos around me to watch the latest from CNBC. Thanks for watching.